Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for Intersections. Whether you are here in person or whether you are online, we are grateful to each of you. I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and we host Intersections each month from September to May, always the first Friday of the month. And we've had a great lineup of speakers already this year and have more in the coming months. If you need the schedule for the year, it's over on the table, as well as a bunch of other information. But feel free to take one of those kind of postcard looking pieces of paper, and you can see other folks. Oh, hello. Let there be light. Anyway, so feel free to take those with you, but thanks for being here. We're going to talk about the life of Harold Hughes today, which I think is going to be a fascinating topic, and I want to welcome Jerry Harrington, who has written a book about the life of Harold Hughes, and Jerry's from Iowa City. Okay, I'm doing this on my phone, and so I have to do this, right? Retired several years ago as a marketing and public relations manager for DuPont Pioneer, and had a career with several different newspapers and different writings, and he's written a couple of different books, but most recently the book on Harold Hughes' life, Thunder from the Prairie. And so I'm going to just welcome Jerry. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to test out sound. Is this coming through clear and amplified?
Is it turned on?
That's supposed to be on?
Yep, there you go.
Is it on now? Okay, and then the other one's on, and I'm getting a nod from that. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity here today. I take it most people here remember Harold Hughes, or at least know of him. This doesn't normally happen to college classes that I talk to. What I'd like to do is give you guys a summary of his life, and I'm going to highlight the aspects of his life that deal from the religious aspect or more. It's not on? We're not getting through it all. Okay. Is that right? Am I coming through now? Okay, now I am. What I'd like to do is review Harold Hughes' life from primarily a moral or religious aspect, but let me begin here by reading a little bit from the book and to give you kind of an update. And I understand we can, and there, by the way, I have copies of the book after it's all done. Harold Hughes, he was born 1922 and passed away in 1996. On the day Harold Everett Hughes was born, February 10th, 1922, a fire destroyed the farm rented by his family outside Ida Grove, Iowa. Recent arrivals in western Iowa from the hills of Kentucky via Illinois, the Hughes family of four survived with only the clothes on their backs. With little money before the blaze, and now totally destitute, they relied on the kindness of kin, their religious faith, and their indomitable will. Born into poverty, Harold Hughes had a special perspective on how life's burden can affect individuals through no fault of their own. As a young man, he faced additional hardships: the violent death of a beloved brother, brutal conflict on the battlefields of Europe, and the severe alcoholism that nearly destroyed him. Overcoming these hurdles, Hughes used his unique leadership talent to become governor of his state and a U.S. senator. But political office is not Hughes' only legacy. It is what he did and how he did it. As Iowa governor, he led a reform of state government with a dynamism not seen in decades, modernizing it to accommodate mid-20th century needs. As a single-term U.S. senator, Hughes vigorously raised the issue of alcoholism as a disease to the national level, spearheading the first federal program to aid sufferers. He was a relentless critic of the Vietnam War, an American military deception. As a politician, Hughes was an inspirational leader who fearlessly addressed controversial issues. Residing within this individual was an uneasy soul of immense contradictions. Hughes was a recovered alcoholic who sought to expand legal liquor sales in Iowa, a college dropout who could easily discourse with intellectuals, a sincere Christian who swore like a vulgar stable hand, and an ambitious politician who walked away from political power to follow his own inner calling. This is the individual born on that day of flames in western Iowa in 1922. But fire may not be the best image to mark this man. Perhaps a better one is thunder, a deep rumbling sound heralding the passion of an Old Testament God. This metaphor, thunder from the prairie, illustrates Harold Hughes, a man of weight and depth who dramatically impacted countless lives, moved others to take productive action, and made a positive difference in the way we live today. So let's go through basic elements of Hughes's life. He was born in Ida Grove, Iowa. He was a World War II veteran, fought in Sicily, in the invasion of Sicily and the invasion of Italy. He was elected to he became a trucker and got involved in organizing truckers in western Iowa, then throughout all of Iowa. He went to 1 year of school at the University of Iowa and then dropped out. He was so ticked off at the abuse of independent truckers in lieu of large trucking firms that he took his complaint to the governor of Iowa, and the governor suggested that he run for one of the state Commerce Commission posts. He won that in a statewide election. He was then elected governor in 1962 for 3 terms and elected to the United States Senate in 1968, after which he retired to enter the lay ministry and to go counsel alcoholics. But this is hardly a description of the man. He was one of the most charismatic politicians in Iowa history. Few come close. He was able to bring people to tears when he talked about compassion and for the underdog. He was a vigorous leader and unafraid to take controversial positions and act on them. And I'm going to go through some of those. But let's go back to his childhood. He was, a regular citizen of Ida Grove, liked hunting, and was very close to his mother, who was a very important person in his life. She instilled within him what I call the concept of the Christian gospel, that it is the command of Christ to help others that are less fortunate than yourselves. And in talking with Hughes's daughter, Phyllis, she really said that this was had a very important impact on Hughes, and impacted not only his religious life, but his political life as well. Hughes also suffered from alcoholism, and he was a person who was incapable of taking one drink. He had to take many. In fact, there were times when he'd go on 3-day binges and not remember anything he'd done over the last 3 days. In 1952, he finally recovered through his own willpower after an event that he describes in his memoir, The Man from Ida Grove, where he sank into a deep depression when his wife left him. And he went into his bathroom, pulled out a gun, and was going to kill himself. At this point in time, at least according to his memoirs, he was so low you have no place else to go but up. And he describes this as a religious conversion, gave up alcohol, and with one exception, never took a drop of alcohol in his life, the rest of his life. This was in 1952. I will talk about the other incident later. Hughes became involved in trucking, as I noted, first in Ida Grove, and then throughout western Iowa. He became involved in organizing independent truckers in lieu of the large trucking firms, pooled together to get insurance rates, to keep their rates high so they don't undercut one another. He found that the Commerce Commission, at least on the local levels and here and there, were taking bribes under the table to give advantages to large truckers. He went to Governor Herschel Lovelace and complained about it, and Lovelace suggested he run for the Commerce Commission post, which then were 3 posts elected statewide. Hughes did and was elected, but first changed his party registration. He was a Western Iowa Republican, And in the election of 1958, he changed his registration from Republican to Democratic, and Iowa politics hasn't been the same since. He looked around when he was in this post and saw that the Democratic Party really wasn't an active party at the time. They were winning some elections toward the late 1950s. But he decided to run for governor in 1960, lost the primary, but impressed an awful lot of people. 1962, he declared himself candidate for governor and got the nomination, but another issue arose, the issue of liquor by the drink. Back then, Iowans were prohibited from ordering liquor over the counter. They could only get it at Iowa liquor stores. In the summer of 1962, the Des Moines Register ran an expose showing that this law was being violated in 66 out of the 99 counties, and that's only where they found it. Hughes came out and said, this just shows disrespect for law. We ought to either change the law or enforce it. And on that issue, he was elected governor, a reformed alcoholic calling for expanded liquor sales. And in the next legislature, he got it changed. Both houses of the Iowa legislature were Republican, and he put together a Republican urban coalition, urban Democratic Republican coalition to pass the laws. Few other laws were passed. Oh, by the way, this is a cartoon on Hughes by Frank Miller in the Des Moines Register the day after Hughes was elected governor. All the other statewide posts were Republicans, and there's a smiling donkey representing Harold Hughes in the middle. 2 years later, he ran for re-election. If you recall, 1964 was the year of Lyndon Johnson's victory over Barry Goldwater, Democratic landslides everywhere. Harold Hughes was expected to win re-election easily over Evan Hultman, who was the Attorney General. On the Friday before the election, there was a debate in downtown Des Moines, sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce. Evan Hultman had found evidence that Harold Hughes in 1954 had gone to Florida to help a friend come back. He left his family, and his family called upon Hughes to bring this friend back to Ida Grove, Iowa, where he lived. And so he did, drove down to Florida, found him, convinced him to come back home, and his friend said, let's celebrate with a drink. Big mistake. Harold Hughes woke up about 3 hours later behind the wheel of a car, railroad tracks, and he spent the night in jail. Evan Hultman had evidence that Harold Hughes had done this. There's also an article in Look magazine where Hughes is quoted as saying the last drink I took was 1952. He'd forgotten about this incident. There was a discrepancy between what he said and what the writer wrote down. Said, Hultman, how can you trust this man? He lies about his alcoholism. It was a Hail Mary shot. So Hultman gets up at this debate, says this, sits down. Up comes Harold Hughes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I regret that the subject of my alcoholism has been brought up. But now I want to respond. Imagine this charismatic voice with this 6'3", 230-pound man. I want to respond. The answer is yes. I was in Florida. I did get drunk there. I was drunk driving my car. I was thrown in jail where I spent the night. But I want to explain one thing, and I'll never talk about it again. And it is this. I regret that my family has to continue to suffer because of my alcoholism. It is bad enough that I suffer, but it's worse that my wife and children have to suffer because of it. I'm deeply hurt that they have to be dragged through this again. I am an alcoholic and will be until the day I die. But with God's help, I'll never touch a drop of alcohol again. Now, can we talk about the real issues of this campaign? And with that, the entire audience rose up in sustained applause. And Evan Hultman was never heard from again. Well, he was a U.S. attorney in northern Iowa later. Yeah. And Harold Hughes won by the biggest landslide of any candidate for governor in the history of Iowa. He outdrew Lyndon Johnson in numbers of votes in Iowa, and Lyndon Johnson paid attention to that. So What we have in the 1965 Iowa legislature, both houses, instead of being Republican, were now Democratic. I won't go into a lot of details here except to say the community college system was set up. The death penalty was abolished at the insistence of Harold Hughes. This was a significant moral issue on his part. And many other reforms were put into place that would have ramifications in later years. The Iowa Civil Rights Act of 1965 and others. And a big issue was reapportionment. Another big issue of the time was the Amish school incident. There were several Amish families in Hazleton, Iowa, who had refused to hire state certified teachers. They were in a conflict with the Old Line School District that was in charge of these small schools, and the conflict had been going on for half a decade. Finally, the Old Line School Board thought they'd reached an agreement with the kids or the parents, basically the elders in this Amish community that were all men. And they took the buses out to their local school to pick the kids up, to take them into school where they had certified teachers. At the last second, someone announced, "Run!" And the kids ran off into the cornfield in what probably to this day is the most significant photo the Des Moines Register has ever carried. They put this across 7 columns of space in the Saturday edition, and in case you missed it, they put it again in the Sunday edition, which had wider statewide distribution. This was a worldwide phenomenon now, and Harold Hughes knew that he had to step in. He met with the Amish fathers for about 3 hours in a very significant and deep conversation about religious faith. And this was the guy to do that with these people. And he established a bond with them. Note in the photo here, we've got the American flag flown upside down, which is an international sign of distress. Hughes met with the Old Line School Board and said, "I'll act as your buffer against outside political pressure. You're only trying to do your job. You're only trying to do what is the law." And what they did, they worked out a system whereby the Amish kids kept their teachers, but they were tested once a year to see that they were learning well, which basically was the only reason to begin with in the first place. So, but Hughes was able to do this and go into areas where probably other people would not have succeeded. He was reelected in '66. The Iowa legislature worked to dramatically reform Iowa government, setting up the Department of Revenue and the Department of Social Services from organizations that had 3-member boards. They were managing these organizations. Income taxes were raised in order to lower property taxes to equalize school funding around the state. There were great disparities in the school funding issue. And this legislature took these studies, and they were not perfect, but it was quite a movement toward reform into an Iowa state government. And there were race relations, even in Iowa with a minority population of about 1%. There were disturbances in Des Moines and Waterloo, and Harold Hughes knew he had to do something. He got out of his comfortable governor's chairs and went into black communities in Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Council Bluffs, Sioux City, and talked with individuals, his fellow Iowans. And he stayed in talking with them sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning. Then he took this and spoke to a group of religious leaders. And in Harold Hughes' way, they said, "The way you're talking to us, you ought to be speaking to the people in the rest of the state." And that's when the crisis conferences started. They were a series of conferences around Iowa in 6 major cities where Harold Hughes took what he learned from black Iowans and talked to others. And this was not a political speech, it was a sermon. And he repeated these 6 times around Iowa, saying things like, "I was appalled by my own ignorance." That is, the conditions of black Iowans. And I could only feel shame that I hadn't done this before. If a man says he loves God and loves not his brother, then he is a liar. And speaking of black America or black Iowans, they can't pull themselves by their own bootstraps if they haven't any boots. It was a plea to understand the plight of current black America and to ask people to put themselves in someone else's shoes and have compassion and understanding. This is the very definition of a progressive leader. And the Vietnam War continued on and intensified, and Harold Hughes began to oppose it. He certainly opposed the bombing over North Vietnam. And as Hughes's time as governor ended, it caught the attention of Robert Kennedy, who was contemplating running against Lyndon Johnson over the war, but at this stage in 1967, he thought they should take opposition to the war into the United States Senate. And he recruited Harold Hughes to run for the Senate seat in 1968. Kennedy, of course, was assassinated in June of 1968. Hughes would have come out for Kennedy. He was a big Kennedy supporter, but wasn't public about it. After Kennedy was assassinated, Hughes came out in favor of Eugene McCarthy, senator from Minnesota, who was opposing Lyndon Johnson in 1968, and he gave the nomination speech at the Democratic Convention, which was the first time I remember seeing Hughes on television. Quite a courageous action on the part of Hughes, and it cost him. In the Senate race of 1968 against Dave Stanley of Muscatine, a very smart, adept candidate, well-funded, Harold Hughes, who had won overwhelming majorities in several elections in the past, found himself locked in a very tight race for the Senate, partially as a result of his opposition to the Vietnam War, although it was not articulated as such. His position was that we should stop the bombing over North Vietnam in order to facilitate the peace process. And also, after 6 years as governor, you make enemies. And out of 1 million votes cast in Iowa for the Senate, Harold Hughes won this race by 4,200 votes. And it wasn't decided until well into the morning hours. In DC, Hughes worked to pass the Hughes Act, is otherwise known as the Comprehensive Alcohol Prevention, Treatment, and Rehabilitation Act of 1970. And what this was, it turned alcoholism from a moral failure to a preventable disease. And Harold Hughes fought tenaciously to get this passed and tenaciously to get it funded over the opposition of the Nixon administration. Those are two separate things, getting a law passed and then getting it funded. Nixon fought it tooth and nail, and Hughes came out on top. Then there was the Vietnam War continuing, the invasion of Cambodia, which Hughes opposed. He opposed it and voted for troops to withdraw from Cambodia after the incursion was ended in 1970. He also supported legislation in order to get American troops withdrawn from Vietnam, which didn't pass the Senate, but Hughes had established himself as a leader in the opposition to the war in Vietnam. And he caught the eyes of several people in Washington and the rest of the country when they started talking about a Democratic candidate in opposition to Richard Nixon in 1972. Supporters of Hughes set up an office in Washington, D.C., and then in Des Moines, Iowa, and they started raising money, significant amounts. By the middle of 1971, there were a couple people from California who said they'd finance Hughes's campaign for the presidency up until the convention. Hughes had a meeting in office in middle of 1971 to talk about this. Should we get serious or not? And he talked about his liabilities. Someone was listening through the air duct system in the office and heard Hughes talk about these liabilities, and rumors started spreading around Washington. The Des Moines Register heard these rumors, and James Rizzer and George Anthem of the Des Moines Register's Washington Bureau approached Hughes's office. We'd like to do a story about your religious beliefs. And Hughes reluctantly said yes. And in the interview, which came out in a Sunday edition July 1971, Hughes said he was a spiritualist, that he believed in talking with the dead, that he had been in seances and had talked with Henry A. Wallace, who had died a few years earlier, and his dead brother Jesse. And he sincerely believed this. He believed in extrasensory perception. He believed in modern miracles. He believed in talking directly with God. And this story with all of this was published in the Register. Within a week, Hughes took himself out of the presidential run. Now, he probably didn't have his heart in it anyway, and I think his family would not have done well. But anyway, It allowed Hughes to concentrate further on foreign policy, because by this time Hughes was on the Senate Armed Services Committee after the 1972 election, which was packed with conservatives. Hughes was the liberal member. Nixon was trying to wind down the war, and in North Vietnam, they had reconnaissance flights going over North Vietnam, followed by bombers. And if they were fired upon, then these bombers had the right to take out the source of these bombings. In 1972, there was a young Cedar Rapids native by the name of Lonnie Franks, who was an intelligence specialist based in the Udorn Air Force Base in Thailand. And he was to report what happened to these reconnaissance flights. In early January, the reconnaissance flights were coming back with their accompanying bombers. The bombers had dropped bombs. Franks asked when they came back, were you fired upon, as were the rules? No, we weren't fired upon, but write down that we were. Lie. And in order to obey the rules of engagement. Lonnie Franks went to his superiors. I've been ordered to lie. What do I do? Son, you obey orders. So he wrote into U.S. intelligence reports things that he knew to be absolute falsehoods. Well, being a Cedar Rapids boy, he knew better. And he wrote a letter to his senator, who was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And among this letters, he said, I am writing this letter to inform you of what is happening and to find out if this falsification of classified documents is legal and proper. This set off a firestorm in Hughes' Senate office. It set off a firestorm in the Pentagon within hours, because Hughes passed it on to the Pentagon and asking the question, what the heck is happening here? Well, he didn't use the word heck. And what did happen, a 3-star general went to Southeast Asia to interview these parties, found out about this contradiction and lies. A 3-star general, John Lavelle, was fired. Initially, it said he was let go because of ill health. Well, that didn't work. And Hughes tried to get to the bottom of this. Who is giving these orders in order to turn reconnaissance flights into bombing missions that were supposedly illegal? And he didn't find an answer while he was senator. However, years later, in the Nixon tapes, it finally came out. The order to disobey orders came directly from Richard M. Nixon and on through Henry Kissinger. Nixon ordered the military to lie. And if caught, they just say that they anticipated on being fired upon. This came out later in the tapes. Harold Hughes never really liked serving in the Senate. He was a former governor, he was an executive. In 1974, he left the Senate and retired to go into religious work and to aid alcoholics and to speak on behalf of alcoholics. And this was the reaction of a lot of Iowa Democrats after Hughes left the scene. That is, you've got an elephant there. Maybe he'll be giving you some sermons that'll inspire you. Well, there was a little bit of inspiration later. When Hughes moved back to Iowa from Maryland in 1981, there was talk of him running for governor again, especially as the Democrats in Iowa had been receiving defeat after defeat since Hughes left at the hand of Bob Ray. So 1982, there was possibility of a clash of Iowa Titans between Bob Ray and Harold Hughes, except someone noticed that Hughes had voted in the Maryland election in 1980, declaring that he was a Maryland citizen. And you have to be a citizen of Iowa for at least 2 years to run for governor. So this quickly ended the speculation, and Hughes dropped out of the race before declaring. I haven't gone into much of Hughes's personal life. He was married to Ava Mercer. They were married at age 18 and 19. The marriage was not a happy marriage. She had mental problems throughout life. A lot of this was kept hidden. And finally, they got a divorce in the 1980s. And Harold Hughes married Julie Holm, who was a little bit older than his oldest daughter, but a very happy marriage here. And now we bring to Harold Hughes, and let me just read something, and I can conclude and then take questions. James Flansburgh The cynical, hard-bitten political reporter and columnist for the Des Moines Register covered generations of Iowa politicians. He wrote of Harold Hughes at his death in 1996, quote, "He was the purest of his kind. His flaws even had a kind of majesty. He never tried to fool himself or pretend to be something he wasn't," end quote. Comparing Hughes to contemporary politicians, Flansburgh continued, quote, "That simple lack of guile is so foreign to politics today that I wonder if those who didn't know and watch Hughes figure I'm speaking in tongues." With an honesty and directness, quote, "With an honesty and directness among politicians of his era, Hughes made a difference, particularly in his state, but in his nation as well. It was in the realm of state politics, government reform, that Hughes left his strongest legacy, tackling challenges that had been untouched for decades. Hughes's efforts on the national scale were not as impactful, but they were significant. There's no better example than his work to create and fund the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Tackling the issue like a tenacious bulldog, Hughes succeeded where others had failed. Like many Americans, Hughes turned against the Vietnam War, believing that it flaunted American ideals. Unlike many others, however, Hughes articulated his opposition in a clear and impassioned manner. Leadership aside, Hughes's story is one of individual inspiration. He successfully fought the demon of alcoholism and used his experience to counsel countless others. In addition to relying on personal willpower and help from his friends to recover, he relied on his Christian faith. This personal Christian outlook, modified over the years, resulted from an intense lifelong journey into the deep river of his soul. Unlike others whose Christianity led them to political conservatism, Hughes's theology guided him to the left of center. This unique trait, together with his ability to change his mind after serious reflection, makes him an individual worth exploring. Thank you. Now I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Jerry. If you have questions, if you'll just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you. Oh, I'm going to start here and then go here.
I remember the incident with the Amish children running into the cornfields. Is that policy still in existence now, or has it been modified, or what has become of that?
Yeah, you're asking an area outside my expertise. It's been modified quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, because obviously we've got homeschooling now. And this Amish issue, were today's policy in effect then, the Amish community schools would not be an issue. You just have, I mean, you have mothers teaching kids now and they're not state certified. So it's been dramatically changed since that time. But those were the laws at that time. Yeah.
Jerry, the book is a terrific read. I thank you for producing it. There's another Cedar Rapids connection. I'd point out to you the capital punishment bill that got changed. The lead sponsor on it was a state senator from here, John Ely.
Okay.
And I went to John and I said, the ACLU of Iowa would like to commend you for your sponsorship of this. And he's, in his humble way, he said, well, Bob, that's not the full story. He said, when I was in the legislature, Governor Hughes called me down to his office and said, John, you will be sponsoring this bill.
He had a pretty persuasive way about it. Yeah.
There's a hand over here somewhere. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, wait.
I've always
Oh,
admired
oh.
Harold Hughes. Are there any other Harold Hughes hanging around?
Oh, he comes by about once in a century. I mean, I'm quoting Jim LaRue. I spoke at his office once, and he commented on that. He is also an Iowa historian. Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I'm not aware of any. Who knows? Keeping you busy here.
I know, I get my steps every time. Here you go, Jonathan.
And I know that it was many years after Hughes left office before there was another Democratic governor of Iowa. Wasn't until Vilsack in 1998.
Mhm.
Before Hughes was governor, how long had it been since there was a Democratic governor in the state?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question because the answer is 2 years. What people, when they look at Iowa at mid-century, a lot of people see it as a universally Republican state. That's not true. Iowa in the 20th century had 2 governors elected during the Great Depression. Now you can chalk that up to rebellion against Herbert Hoover and popularity of Franklin Roosevelt. There was Clyde Herring elected in 1932 and 1934 as governor, and then Nelson Crashall elected in 1936. Then basically Iowa went back to its Republican ways. However, in the late 1950s, what we see is the growth of urban areas in Iowa, the growth of labor unions, the more on the national level, moving more toward progressive politics. And most importantly, what you see is the organization of the Democratic Party beginning in Des Moines and spreading out to other urban areas with several activists taking part in this. And what you see is this new organization, these new instances, urban labor unions and other aspects, building up toward 1956, 1958, where Herschel Lovelace of Ottumwa was elected the Democratic governor in 56 and 58. He ran for Senate in 1960 and lost to Jack Miller. But and in the election of 1958, half of Iowa's congressional delegation was Democratic. So Hughes was part of this movement. He was not alone. But and a lot of people look about Hughes as kind of raising the Democratic Party up from a party that didn't have much electoral success. But there was a predecessor political movement to Hughes. So between 1956 and 1966, there were 10 years of governorships. 8 of those 10 were Democratic. Thanks. I've wanted to talk about that. Yeah.
I'm interested in the question of Christian conservatives who, became liberals, and, Hughes is kind of a good example of that. Also,
Yeah.
Another is Jim Wallace with Sojourners, who came out of, pardon me, the evangelical movement.
Yeah.
And, but it's interesting now that there's such a strong divide that Christian conservatives are pretty much political conservatives as well. And, I wonder why Hughes was able to kind of break away from that mold.
Well, I don't know that there was much of a mold to break away from at the time he began forming his political opinions. I just think he sincerely and literally took the commands of Christ to care for the least of your brothers, literally. And there was the compassion in him that kept him from taking hard and fast positions. He was anti-abortion. So, I mean, to say he was a total liberal of the 1960s and 70s would not be true. And he was able to cross ideological lines that way. He simply thought that things like the death penalty was absolutely immoral. He took literally, thou shalt not kill, and that meant the state. He looked at anti-communism and said, yeah, I mean, communism is bad, but so is supporting a military junta in its name in South Vietnam. So, and he carried that, if you will, that quasi-liberalism over into his post-Senate years when he worked for the Christian Fellowship in Washington, D.C., which was his religious work. And this was the same organization that sponsored the prayer breakfasts in the national capital. And this organization was, what you see is the growth of the religious right in the late 1970s, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and others. And this organization was connected with that. That is the right wing. Hughes grew extremely uncomfortable within the Christian Fellowship. And finally, that's one of the reasons, among others, that he moved back to Iowa and discontinued his relationship with that. They were becoming so right wing, it was uncomfortable to be there. I just chalk it up to the uniqueness of Harold Hughes. And my definition of Christianity would be that he was a sincere one.
I'm wondering about if you are knowledgeable about his relationship with Bob Ray and
Yeah.
how Bob Ray was pretty moderate in today's terms, and was a man of faith. I actually grew up in the church that Bob Ray attended, and just interested in that relationship.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm getting asked some great questions here today. Bob Ray, during Hughes's governorship, was chairman of the Republican Party in Iowa. And it was Bob Ray's job to get up every morning and criticize Harold Hughes. Bob Ray was a moderate Republican. I mean, I'm using these vague terms. I think you kind of understand what they are. There was a conservative wing of the Republican Party, and Bob Ray found himself in conflict often with that wing, led by, among others, Burke Hickenlooper, senior senator from Iowa. And Ray was also allied with Hultman, the Attorney General. Then there was quite a conflict in the 1964 Republican convention when Ray supported another candidate other than Barry Goldwater. Ray was able to say, "I told you so," after November. So he was in opposition to Hughes during those years. But I remember talking with Hughes's top aide, Dwight Jensen, who is still alive today in Iowa City. And he said, we kind of looked at Bob Ray, we sort of admired him. I mean, he's got a tough political position, and we kind of liked him, and we got along quite well. So I don't know about the personal relationship, but there was a respect certainly from Hughes's side of Bob Ray, because he was not a conservative Republican. I think when you look at the span of history, during the Hughes and the Ray administration, what you see is Hughes beginning reform of state government and Ray continuing it. Hughes was a guy that would say, okay, we need to do these big things, and he'd let others decide what the details were. Ray was probably a guy that got involved in the details with his lawyer-like ability. But I think from 1963 to 1982, when the Hughes and Ray administration, over a period of 20 years, Iowa was pretty well served by two progressive governors that had a lot more in common than they had in differences.
Did you ever meet him?
Yeah. Oh, you're supposed to. The question was, did I ever meet him? Yeah. I was a student at Cornell College in 1974, and Hughes came to the campus. And he was kind of led into the back of the commons area, and I was sitting there because I wanted to get a good seat. And there were like 2 or 3 people there, and they plopped, the senior U.S. senator in the middle of this place, and his aides left. And where is everybody? And there was no one there. And I said, well, it's Monday night. I remember, for some reason, it's Monday night. Maybe a lot of them are watching football. I don't have time for that. And soon people started coming in. And the reason he was there, he was campaigning for Michael Bluen, who was running for Congress that year. So that was my only interaction with him, of being this little moron off to the side. So that's my only interaction with him.
Do you think there's any Democrat currently that could be the current Republican governor?
I don't know. I mean, there may be one in well, I don't know. I'm not into history. I'm not into predictions.
Good answer.
Another question I get asked is, do you think Harold Hughes, if he'd sustained his presidential campaign, if he could have won the nomination? As you may recall, 1972, George McGovern won the Democratic nomination and went down to inglorious defeat, carrying Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. And Richard Nixon carried all the others. And I guess what I'd the way I answer this is ideologically, if you put George McGovern and Harold Hughes with a charisma meter next to them, the charisma meter would barely register with George McGovern, and with Harold Hughes, it'd go off the charts. But I think McGovern had something that Hughes didn't have, and that is he had ambition and a heart and a desire to win the nomination. Hughes did not have that. Hughes also probably had a problem with his family. I don't think his wife could have, I don't want to use the word survived, but she would have been extremely uncomfortable being the wife of the candidate for the presidency of the United States. And I don't think Harold Hughes really had the desire and the gut and the fire in the belly in order to initiate a campaign like that. And that's why he very easily withdrew after the newspaper article came out about his religious beliefs. I think he would have made a heck of a president, but whether he could have defeated Richard Nixon, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know whether you would know anything about this, but a long time ago, this was about 1994, I'm active in the National Federation of the Blind, and the president of the National Federation for the Blind, was Kenneth Jernigan for many years, who had his start, well, it wasn't his start, but probably some of his most important work was in developing the Iowa Department for the Blind from the worst agency in the country to one of the best.
Yeah.
And it was during the Hughes administration, at least shortly after Hughes became there, that it started really making that kind of a rise. And I happened to be at a place where Kenneth Jernigan was actually in a small group discussion about his relations with Harold Hughes. And didn't say anything about he'd had good support from the government. Jernigan himself was a very shrewd politician. And he mentioned that as Hughes was deciding to go on to the Senate, that there was discussion of Jernigan being the next Democratic candidate. It didn't come to happen. I can't remember exactly how that didn't happen, but do you know anything about this?
No, I don't know about Jernigan. Paul Franzenberg was the one who was the Democratic nominee in 1968 and was defeated by Bob Ray. But no, that's new on me. I don't know anything about that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just a comment.
Hold on, Real.
You need the microphone.
Yeah. I was working for the Department of Human Service during the time that Harold Hughes was governor, and there were profound changes that happened with what we now know as DHS.
Yeah.
The Board of Control merged with the Board of Social Welfare, for instance, and I think they went from having, I don't know if they were elected or appointed.
They were appointed by a governor every 3 years, and there were a 3-member board.
And then they went to directorships.
Yeah.
And it had a profound. It took a lot of the politics out, and they became more professional.
Yeah.
And I know as a public child welfare worker at the time, it really had an impact on us, and it had an impact on the state institutions. The Board of Control had Woodward and Glenwood, and they had the 4 state mental health institutes, and so that really impacted in a very positive way all of the human services delivery in the state of Iowa.
Yeah.
And it was a great thing that he did.
Well, just think what it was. Both the social welfare, whatever it was called in the beginning, had 3-member leadership. And in the best of all situations, that doesn't really work. So did I think of the tax board changed into the tax commission. And in both instances, they changed it from 3-member boards to an executive. that reported to the governor. And otherwise, the governor had very little control over these boards, because he appointed one person every 3 years. And in any situation, you may have two people in opposition to you, and you're supposed to be the head of the executive branch. But now it made it more accommodating to people that understood that these people report to the governor, and the governor then is up for re-election every 2 years.
Usually, for instance, the department or the Board of Social Welfare were people that were like ex-senators who were opposed to welfare. I mean, that's who they usually appointed. It's like, we're gonna hold those poor people down a little more by having these kind of people in. And secondly, then I don't remember, I'm bad at dates, but after Hughes had been a U.S. Senator and was doing his Christian work, I was a part of a group there were Catholics, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, and unions, and the labor unions in AFL-CIO in Iowa went together to work on changing the tax structure in Iowa to make it more progressive. And Harold Hughes came and was our speaker, and of course used some biblical references. And we're in a church. I remember he used Amos, about Amos giving the people of Israel hell for treating poor people so badly. It's like, you got to treat poor people better. And so that was his whole pitch on making the taxes in Iowa more progressive. And we were able to do that. And I think he was a lot of the inspiration of that happening.
Yeah.
And we did. We added steps to the progressivity of the state income tax. We reduced. That group was able to take sales tax off of prescriptions and groceries, still
to this
holds
day.
Today.
Yeah.
And then do some reduction of property tax for people with disabilities and senior citizens. And I don't know if that still exists, if those parts of course, the progressivity has just been wiped out.
Yeah.
But Harold Hughes had a hand in doing that. And so I'm always very grateful to the man from Ida Grove.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he was a leader in '72 for the wave of changes they did for the tax system then. The story I hear is that it was late in the legislative session, early June, I think it was, in '67, and they'd had these recommendations from an economist at Purdue and another series of recommendations on government reform from an institution in Chicago. And it was late in the session. He got Republican and Democratic leaders together, the Democratic Senate leadership and the Republican leadership in the House, got them around the table and says, okay, what do you guys want? And they point, and they made their points. And okay, let's draw that up. And it was an influential meeting with the leadership of Hughes from Republicans and Democrats. And I really have to give these guys credit. Republicans and Democrats sitting in the same room with the Democratic governor doing something that was for the good of the state. I mean, I think that's a shining example of what can be done.
The last thing I would, just one more thing. What I mostly remember about Hughes is his booming voice, and you thought God was speaking to you when you heard his voice. You really did it, and I bet anybody that heard him will remember that ring voice.
Yeah, it was magnificent. Yeah, a voice borrowed from God, and I think he gave it back at the last minute. Yeah, he was not a well person. He was not a good person in his last days. Yeah. Anyway, his voice sort of failed him, but he was a lifelong smoker too.
Any other last questions? Well, help me to thank Jerry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. These are great questions.
We, for next intersections, just want to let you know what's happening. We will be back here and talking about mental health and criminal justice system with Tony Thompson, who is the Blackhawk County Sheriff. So we will be back here. Just to let you know, the church is doing some remodeling beginning in January. And so we will be in a different space. We will still be here at the church, but we will be in a different space beginning in January. And so we'll give you a lot of notice on that and where we'll be and all of that. So just wanted to kind of give you a heads up. So December, we're back here in this space. But beginning in January, we will be in another space in the church. Also wanted to let you know about an event. This is not our event, but because we've been doing a lot of work on Christian nationalism, there's an event at the Old Capitol Museum. I assume that's at the University of Iowa. Tonight, 6 to 7:30 on authoritarianism and Christian nationalism in Viktor Orban's Hungary. And the speaker is Ben Novak, and it is streamed as well. So I'll put this flyer over on the table. Don't take it with, because other people may want to look at it too. But if you're interested in that speech tonight, whether it is in person or online. So just wanted to give you that information. And of course, last but not least, we have an election. Did you know that? And I know all of you are voters, and most of you probably have already voted. But if you haven't, we encourage you. We don't tell people who to vote for or how to vote, but we do encourage people to vote. And this, of course, is a critically important election, not only at the national level, but in our state as well. So encourage everyone to vote. I have my little vote pin, and I love voting day of and going and putting my little ballot in and all of that. So I'll be voting on Tuesday, but whenever and however you vote, just encourage you to do so. Thank you so much. Thanks to the folks who are watching online, and thanks to everybody in the room, and have a great weekend.